Zigzag Theory, the definitive answer. Hello, folks. I'm Joe Duffy, CEO of OffshoreInsiders.com. Now, for those of you who are new to betting, you're wondering what the zigzag is. It's a long theory in the industry that in the NBA playoffs, you bet on the team that is coming off of a loss. You bet on the team coming off a straight-up loss, and you bet them ATS. Now, there's many supporters and many detractors. In fact, it cracks me up that there's a guy from a once great tip sheet way back in the days before the internet, sports reporter started by Richie Bombs. He was one of the top sources for handicapping information. It's kind of really lost its mojo and its relevancy over the years. And they got this one guy, Bobby Smith, who I think is now the editor. And if you read this guy's articles, he is consumed, absolutely consumed with doing nothing more than lambasting those who are, frankly, have surpassed him in the industry, or at least his publication that he inherited, the sports reporter. And his favorite target is the zigzag. He's absolutely obsessed and preoccupied, borderline neurotic. Every single year on one of the websites that also carries my content, he does nothing other than mock the zigzag theory. Now, he never comes out with an original thought himself, but you want to know what? I tend to agree a lot with what he says. The one thing that he's not aware of, there is a sharp, modified version of it, and then the square version, which he mocks. But the sharp version is much lesser known, to say the least. And basically, it's not 100% objective. We always said the difference between a system and an angle is a system basically says you specifically will bet something based on these parameters, and that one's pretty objective. Whichever team loses straight up the previous game, you bet on the next game. The angle, which is actually the sharp version of that, says you weigh it based on several factors. If the teams are evenly matched, the more evenly matched those teams are, the heavier it weighs. There aren't too many sweeps that aren't involving the number 1 against the 8 team. So, yeah, in fact, the guy above, he always mocks it in the middle of the first round, and then by the second and the third round in the NBA Finals, he goes pretty quietly. And that's because there are obviously a lot more mismatches in the first round. Also, the better the team coming off a loss, the more heavier we weigh it. So, in other words, the number 8 team that's going to lose 3 times before they're finally eliminated in that 4th game, yeah, they're the teams that, and the number 7 seeds generally going to lose the series, and they're the teams that we weigh it less heavily. So the better the team is coming off of a loss, the stronger it is. That's why it becomes stronger each and every round. And also, the bigger the margin of the spread loss. Notice I said spread loss, not straight-up loss, in part because that takes into account home court advantage, where there's an 8-point net difference. In other words, if 2 evenly matched teams were playing on a neutral court, which doesn't happen in the NBA, but it would be a pick'em game. But then Team A would generally be a 4-point home favorite, and then Team B would be a 4-point home favorite. So thus, an overall 8-point swing. So that is why the margin of spread loss is much more important. For example, I know a pretty good gambler who calls it his bounce back theory, that he will go with a team that is off of a blowout or a bad home loss. And that obviously, based on, we think home court is worth approximately 4 points in the NBA. So therefore, a loss that on hypothetically a 4-point home loss, if it were hypothetically played on a neutral court, would be the equivalent of an 8-point neutral loss or a 12-point road loss. That is why we say the margin of spread loss. The bigger that is, the more we will go with the quote-unquote zigzag theory, which in reality is a bounce back. So again, the zigzag works if and only if it is weighed more heavily based on how evenly matched the 2 teams are, The better the team is off of the spread, the better the team off of the straight-up loss is, and the bigger margin of spread setback that the team coming off a loss is. Now, critics such as the professional attacker above, as we said, are much more vocal in the first round when you have the number 8 and number 7 seeds that, frankly, are number 8 and 7 seeds because they didn't do a great job bouncing back from losses as opposed to the number 1 and 2 seeds, which they obviously are good coming off of a loss, or else they wouldn't have one of the best records in the conference. Also, and that is especially so, of course, in what over the last 10 years where the Eastern Conference hasn't had the depth of the Western Conference, the number 7 and 8 teams in the Eastern Conference generally are not well to bet on off of the zigzag theory. So there's a huge difference betting on a team with a 700 winning percentage off of a straight-up loss as compared to betting on an under 500 team, which does happen in the Eastern Conference playoffs. Sometimes when an under 500 team or a team just barely over 500 will make the postseason. Now, why is there a sharp version of this as opposed to the square version? Well, there's a huge difference between good teams playing with urgency and bad teams playing with urgency. Also, underdogs off of a big loss are much more concerned with avoiding another embarrassment. So if you have a team that is going to be an underdog coming off of the loss, but they were beaten by 20 points the previous game, they're not only, of course, want to win the game, but at the very, very least, they want to keep the game close. So there's an urgency to avoid another humiliation. Obviously, a team playing with much more of a vengeance if they're off of a 22-point loss than they would be if they're off a 22-point win. And keep in mind that the playoffs are about adjustments. And if they are truly a playoff caliber team, they have successfully made adjustments. Now, also, the mockers don't take into account this angle traces the roots back long before 16 teams made the playoffs. So the definition of a quote-unquote playoff team has certainly changed, but in the eyes of the sharp player, not a playoff caliber team. In other words, in the NBA, from a handicapping standpoint, there are not 16 playoff caliber teams, even though there are 16 teams that do make the playoffs. So again, when the zigzag first became popular, to make the playoffs, you frankly had to earn it, which you don't have to earn it if 16 teams are making the playoffs. That is why we said the zigzag becomes stronger as the playoffs go on. Once a team makes it to the final 8 of the NBA, you know they do generally fit comfortably into the quote-unquote playoff caliber team. So yes, the mocker is somewhat right, as anybody who simply blindly bets the zigzag theory as it is defined in the modern-day NBA, where you don't have to be quote-unquote playoff caliber to actually make the playoffs. But what this sports reporter guy isn't aware of is the sharp version. He's not a sharp player, so therefore he's not aware of the sharp version. You've got to be a sharp player to know the sharp version of the angle. You want to know what? Anyone who truly is a sharp player is not consumed with demonizing everyone else. We're too busy sharpening our skills. So the zigzag theory, as it is written by blind definition, we don't subscribe to it, but there is that sharp version. And again, it is weighed more heavily based on how evenly matched the teams are. The quality of the team coming off of the straight-up loss, the better, the stronger it is. And how big of a margin of spread loss. The bigger spread loss they're coming off of, the more likely they are to bounce back, make their adjustments, and come to their means. And it's essentially that. If a team is like off of a 20-point loss as, say, an 8-point underdog, so they lose by 12 ATS, they have more positive adjustments they can make, where the team that's coming off of the win really isn't going to make any major adjustments. So there it is. Make sure if you want the best picks from the best handicappers, you go to offshoreinsiders.com. Don't forget we have added Bill Tanner, one of the top handicappers in the business, and his absolute best sport is the NBA. His picks are now exclusively on offshoreinsiders.com. Again, that's www.offshoreinsiders.com, where you can get my picks. Joe Duffy, part of God's Tips, which is the anchor of OffshoreInsiders.com.